A man forced a door open and pulled an exhausted girl out of a cave. Her consciousness was starting to go dim. The poor thing was 17 kilograms down and had already lost track of days spent in captivity. In this video, I've gathered the creepiest stories of people who'd been isolated for some time. Some were deprived of light, others had no sense of time, and some had to go without all of this at once and didn't even have any food. Some of them did it voluntarily, and others were forced. So, what did people miss the most in captivity? What were their first words upon being set free? What happened to that poor girl? Watch this video until the end to find out, but I'm warning you. As always, viewer discretion is advised. August 5th, 2010, Copiapó, Chile. Luis Urzua and his subordinates were deep under the ground in San Jose copper gold mine located in the ruthless Atacama Desert. Together with his colleagues, Luis was chipping away at the ore when suddenly, one afternoon, he sensed some strange vibrations. Luis wasn't the only one who felt them too. The miners didn't heed it much, but they should have. Soon, they heard something like a powerful explosion, and the mine started filling with debris, so much so that the dust caused zero visibility for a few minutes. As it turned out, a giant rock had separated from the wall, virtually blocking the mine exit. This mega block was the size of a 45-floor building and twice the weight of the Empire State Building, a whopping 770,000 tons. So, of course, there was no way for the miners to push the rock out of the way. Only an ore truck driver managed to miraculously escape since, at the time of the collapse, he was close to the surface. And Luis, as well as 32 other workers, ended up in a horrible trap 700 meters below the ground. Luis Urzua quietly said, "It's like the stone they put over Jesus' tomb." For some reason, the ventilation shafts that were supposed to be the miners' way out lacked the ladders required by safety regulations. So, the workers were utterly helpless in this situation. Luis told his subordinates to gather in a small room that remained intact and that they'd built in case of disasters to keep themselves safe from new possible collapses. The miners called it shelter. It was a tiny, dark room. The men only had food and water for 3 days, which is why the miners each had a meager ration of 2 teaspoons of tuna, a gulp of milk, and half a cookie every 48 hours. The air was hot and humid, making it increasingly harder to breathe with each passing day. To keep physically active, the miners would sometimes leave shelter to stretch their legs. However, their isolation wasn't just a physical trap. It was a psychological nightmare, since the miners weren't sure they'd even be found, or that someone was even searching for them. In reality, the rescue efforts started right after the collapse. However, the depth of the mine and the hardiness of the rock complicated all attempts to get through to the victims. The drilled boreholes ended up too small to allow the rescuers to see where exactly the miners could be, and larger boreholes could have caused new collapses. For 17 days, no one even knew whether the miners were still alive. However, on August 22nd, a probe was lowered into a borehole. When it was brought back to the surface, a note was taped to it that read, "We are well in the shelter, the 33 of us." At that point, the entire South America was following the rescue efforts, and this message came as a huge relief for everyone. Through this same borehole, the miners received food. This improved the situation a bit, but the rescue was still far from happening. It would take several weeks to get the victims out. After food, communication devices were lowered into the shelter. The miners were in critical condition. However, Urzua kept his calm and told the rescuers on the surface that they were all fine and waiting to be saved. Then, the miners also received a camera. This is the first shot ever taken with that camera in the mine. It shows that every one of the miners had lost around 8 kilograms. But soon, after 69 days of isolation, everything changed. On October 12th, the final phase of the rescue operation started. The rescuers winched the miners to the surface one by one in a special capsule. On October 13th, 2010, at around 10 p.m., the rescuers saved the last of the miners. Luis, who decided to let his subordinates go ahead, finally he was able to inhale fresh air and hug his family. The miners managed to survive thanks to the strength of their spirit, as well as the organization and discipline maintained in the team by Urzua. However, staying under the ground for such a long time did not go without its consequences. A lot of these miners now suffer from diabetes and pneumoconiasis. a lung condition caused by prolonged inhalation of dust that leads to the inflammation and scarring of the lung tissue. Furthermore, the victims of the accident still haven't recovered from the psychological trauma brought about by their subterranean entrapment. If you ever end up in a similar situation, you should also figure out how you're going to distribute your resources and keep physically active. It goes without saying, however, that even this planning wouldn't have helped the miners if not for the constant work of the rescuers, as they'd run out of food shortly before a borehole was drilled into their shelter. Otherwise, the miners would have starved to death. The same fate could have befallen gold diggers in Tanzania in 2015. 5 men went underground in an attempt to save 11 of their colleagues who got trapped after a collapse in an unregulated mine. The 5 men had been trying to reach their mates at a depth of approximately 100 meters, but ended up in a deadly trap themselves because of a new collapse. The locals tried to organize a search effort, but these attempts stopped after a week. The hope of finding someone alive died. Furthermore, disasters like this are typical for this area. The local gold diggers work in conditions lacking even the most basic safety regulations. Gold digging was a conscious choice of the victims, and they knew the price could turn out too steep. 41 days passed. Suddenly, faint screams coming from under the ground caught the attention of miners working nearby. They immediately informed the rescuers of the gold diggers' whereabouts. The victims were found and brought back to the surface safely. Everyone was bewildered as to how the gold diggers had managed to survive without food. As it turned out, the men stayed alive for that entire time thanks to eating plant roots, frogs, roaches, and even soil. As for drinking, they consumed the dirty water seeping through the ground. As you can see, it's necessary to forego disgust and eat whatever is at least somewhat edible in such conditions. Sadly, the 11 gold diggers the men had been trying to save, as well as another one of their colleagues who went searching for them, are still missing and have most likely died under the ground. However, there are stories of people ending up isolated in much more bizarre ways. January 13, 1989, Carlsbad, New Mexico, United States. The door was shut tight and locked behind Stefania Fellini. The girl looked around. In front of her, there was a small dwelling with a low ceiling. It was lit by several dim lamps and had transparent walls and video cameras. Most interestingly, the room was located in a cave at a depth of 11 meters. But who locked Stefania in this isolation and was going to watch her? It was NASA. Moreover, the woman was there completely voluntarily. The Italian interior designer agreed to undergo a pretty strange experiment. NASA had launched this project to study circadian rhythms and the impact of isolation on the human psyche. The girl's task was to spend 210 days in the cave with no clocks or calendars. Thus, while staying in a deep, dark cave, Stefania was deprived of any sense of time. In addition, she was also limited in her interactions with others. She could only contact the outside world by pressing a single button, meaning that the girl had decided to terminate the experiment. After its end, she was in for a generous remuneration. Its exact sum was unknown. Tell us in the comments, what amount of money would convince you to agree to such incarceration? For instance, Beatrice Flamini self-isolated in a cave in Granada, Spain, absolutely for free and of her own free will. The woman wanted to test her resilience and allowed scientists to use her experience for research. Beatrice's living conditions were even worse than Stefania's. She wasn't staying in a room specifically built for the experiment that met all of the minimal survival requirements. Beatrice was living in an actual cave surrounded by bare rock walls. In the beginning, both women treated their isolation as an exciting adventure. Stefania was enthusiastically reading books and exercising. Everything was going to plan. Her sleep and meals seemed to be organized. Despite having no alarm clock, the girl intuitively slept for 8 to 10 hours and was enjoying her peace since the cave was completely silent. Eventually, however, it became unbearable for Stefania. In 2 months, the experimenters noticed her state beginning to shift. The woman's biological clock was disrupted. She started sleeping longer, sometimes for 20 consecutive hours. The experimenters decided to spice up Stefania's life and brought her a guitar, a computer with simple games, and 2 pet mice she befriended. Beatrice, in her turn, did art and physical exercise and documented her experience to help scientists understand the impact of extreme isolation. The woman created her own schedule and could sleep, eat, and read whenever she wanted to. Beatrice treated her captivity with lightness and curiosity. This helped her keep clarity of mind and avoid the apathy faced by her colleague. On the 19th day of isolation, Stefania became indifferent to the computer as well as her pets and looked absolutely exhausted. She read less and less and didn't play with the mice. Instead, she spent hours staring at a single spot on the wall. Her apathy was terrifying. The scientists feared that Stefania had completely lost control over her own body and consciousness. After 120 days, the girl was almost on the brink. She'd lost weight, and her menstrual cycle had been disrupted. Sometimes Stefania would go several days without eating. She'd only drink water and again submerge into a deep sleep for a day or more. On day 130, one of NASA's employees insisted the girl should be set free. The rest of his colleagues were against it. This would supposedly violate the purity of the experiment, since Stefania still hadn't pressed the button. Then, the experimenter decided to go against everyone else. Alone, he descended into the cave, forced the door open, and helped the girl get out. When Stefania got back to the surface, she was caught off guard by the flashes of cameras. Here's the first photo of her made outside of the cave. The first thing she did was look upward, squinting, and say, "I love the sun. The sun is very beautiful." Then Stefania hugged her friends and said, "The smell of human beings is very beautiful." Although the girl is smiling in the photo, her condition is actually horrible. After her exit, Stefania was weak and disoriented. She thought she hadn't spent over 60 days in the cave. The isolation had ruined her physical and psychological state to such a degree that NASA had to admit such experiments were dangerous. The findings were clear. Without any outer reference points such as the change of night and day, a person loses control of their biological clock, which negatively impacts psychological health. Rehabilitation took Stefania 2 years. Although the girl reportedly received a prize for participation in the experiment, she didn't recommend that anyone else ever repeat it. On April 12, 2023, smiling as widely as Stefania, Beatrice exited her cave. Yet, unlike her colleague, the Spanish mountaineer spent an entire 500 days in the cave. In addition, she also felt great. When her support group came to Beatrice after the end of the experiment, the woman was very surprised since she thought she spent only around 170 days in the cave. However, this doesn't mean anyone can replicate this experience. Please keep in mind that these 2 experiments were done under the surveillance of scientists, and self-isolating without outside assistance is dangerous for your physical and mental health. Yet, there are stories of people doing it on a bet. November 2019, Las Vegas, United States. Rich Elati, a professional poker player notorious for his risky bets, made a deal with another gambler, much like himself, Rory Young. Rich was claiming he'd spend 30 days in total darkness with 0 social interaction. For this, Young promised Elati $100,000. This experiment was held in a bathroom stripped of all light sources. For his isolation, Rich was allowed to take only a yoga mat, an expander, and a massage ball. Food was brought in at different times to prevent the man from keeping track of time. The bathroom was equipped with a camera through which Rich's father could watch over his son. He had the right to stop the experiment if he noticed something strange in Rich's behavior. Apart from that, Elati could exit the game at any point on his own initiative. But then, according to the wager, he'd have to pay Young $100,000. Just 2 days after the start of the experiment, Young made a concession and offered Rich $25,000 if he quit the challenge almost at the very start. Elati took an hour to mull it over, but eventually declined. In the first days, Rich was trying to stay active by exercising and thinking about poker strategies. However, with every passing day, the situation became more difficult. On the 3rd day, the first signs of crisis appeared. Rich started hallucinating. It seemed to him that the room was filling up with bubbles, and then the ceiling cracked, revealing starry skies. The man's thoughts were becoming increasingly chaotic, but he tried to distract himself with yoga. His sleep cycle started slipping. The inner clock was disrupted, and the loneliness became unbearable. On the 20th day of silence and darkness, his mental state reached a critical point. His hallucinations became more frequent, and it seemed to Rich that he was surrounded by something invisible, but, in his mind, real. This sensation resulted in anxiety and panic. The man didn't feel like an experimenter. He'd fallen prey to his illusions. Then, in a moment of despair, he he decided to ask to be let out early. After negotiating for a while, Young agreed to pay Rich, but only $62,400. In Elati's own words, he hasn't had any side effects to his isolation. Still, his experience has become an important reminder that as humans, we are social creatures, and depriving oneself of light, a sense of time, and the company of others for fun is really dangerous. After all, the memories of terrifying hallucinations haunt Rich to this day. However, there's a creepy story about prolonged isolation to which a person was subjected by force. 2009. Sarah Shord joined her two friends on a hike to the picturesque mountains of Kurdistan in Iraq. The group members were so entranced by the beauty of nature and the exploration of remote paths that they didn't even realize they'd accidentally crossed the border to Iran. The friends were immediately detained by the Iranian military. All three were arrested on suspicion of spying and sent to Evin prison in Tehran. The conditions turned out to be horrible. Sarah ended up locked in a solitary confinement cell. They usually look quite primitive, a tiny room with a cold concrete floor. The windows, if present, are small and grated, blocking natural light from entering the room. This creates an atmosphere of constant darkness that makes it hard for the person to perceive time. The lack of human contact, the confined space, and the silence had a terrible influence on Sarah's consciousness. She spent most of her time crouching by the door of her cell, hoping to hear at least the tiniest sound through a crack. After 2 months of isolation, she started seeing ghostly figures and hearing non-existent sounds. At some point, she even hallucinated strange lights flickering in the periphery of her vision. The absolute horror, however, was when Sarah suddenly heard someone scream after the long silence. Then, she felt the guard slap her on the face lightly, as if he wanted to bring her back from unconsciousness. Then, Sarah realized that the scream was her own. Her isolation went on for almost 10,000 hours. Eventually, after 14 months, Sarah was set free, but the repercussions of this experience lingered on. The girl often recalled the hallucinations that haunted her long after she returned to normal life. In Sarah's words, the psychological problems were the most horrible consequences of the isolation. According to her, that whole time, while being alone, she'd been repressing her emotions, and after she was set free, the feelings were also unleashed. Psychotherapy was the only remedy for the girl. This practice made her understand that she needed some kind of mission. So now Sarah works as an independent journalist and human rights strategy consultant in Oakland, California. Apart from that, Shord has written, produced, and later directed a play titled The Box about solitary confinement. Hussein al-Shahristani spent 11 years in a solitary cell after refusing to work on nuclear weapons. He kept his sanity by solving math problems. A scientist named Edith Bone was locked up for 7 years. She created an abacus out of bread and counted her vocabulary. A participant in a round-the-world sailing boat race, Donald Crowhurst, couldn't bear the loneliness and jumped overboard. His body was never found. How long could you handle complete isolation? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. More real-life accounts of people facing extreme conditions await.